Hello and welcome to Dr SpeakNow 6-Minute English. I'm David.
And I'm Anna. And I have to say, today's topic is one that weighs heavily on me personally. Because every day this war continues, real people are losing their lives, their homes, and their futures.
It weighs on all of us, Anna, because today we are asking one of the most urgent and most consequential questions in current world affairs. Will the Russia-Ukraine war ever end? It is a conflict that has already lasted longer than most experts predicted. It has killed hundreds of thousands of people. It has displaced millions. It has reshaped the global economy, transformed European security, and pushed the relationship between Russia and the Western world to its most dangerous point since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And as of today, there is no peace deal in sight. So, how does this end? And when?
This is a question with no easy answers, but it is one that every person on Earth has a stake in understanding.
Absolutely. But first, I have a question for you, Anna.
Go ahead.
Since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Ukraine has received military and financial support from Western nations. According to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, how much total aid, military, financial, and humanitarian combined, had Western countries committed to Ukraine by the end of 2023? Was it A, $100 billion, B, $230 billion, or C, $380 billion?
Those are all extraordinary numbers for a conflict that many people initially expected to last just a few weeks. I'll guess B, $230 billion.
Very interesting. I'll reveal the correct answer later in the program. Now, let's get into it. To understand whether and how this war might end, we first need to understand why it began and why it has proven so extraordinarily difficult to stop. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022 was the culmination of decades of deepening tension between Moscow and Kiev, rooted in competing visions of Ukrainian identity, sovereignty, and geopolitical alignment. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly argued that Ukraine is not a genuinely independent nation, that Ukrainians and Russians are, in his words, one people, and that Ukraine's growing closeness to Western institutions, particularly NATO and the European Union, represents an existential threat to Russian security. Ukraine and the overwhelming majority of the international community rejected this framing entirely. Ukraine is a sovereign nation recognized under international law, with the right to determine its own foreign policy and its own alliances. Russia's invasion was a fundamental violation of that sovereignty and of the post-World War II international order that prohibits the conquest of territory by force. What has made this conflict so resistant to resolution is the profound asymmetry of war aims between the two sides. For Russia, the minimum acceptable outcome appears to be permanent control over the territories it has seized, including Crimea, annexed in 2014, and the 4 regions it claimed to annex in 2022: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, even though Russian forces do not fully control all of them. For Ukraine, accepting Russian control over any Ukrainian territory is constitutionally, legally, and morally impossible, not just as a political position, but as a matter of national survival and international law. If Ukraine accepts territorial loss through negotiation, it sets a precedent that conquest by military force is rewarded and potentially invites further aggression in the future. These two positions are not merely different, they are, at their core, incompatible. And incompatible war aims are the single greatest obstacle to any negotiated peace. Professor Lawrence Friedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, and one of the world's most respected military historians, argues that wars of this type, where one side is fighting for national survival and the other for territorial expansion, rarely end through negotiated compromise. They end through one of three paths. The first path is military victory. One side defeats the other so comprehensively on the battlefield that the losing side has no realistic option but to accept terms. The second path is exhaustion. Both sides become so depleted in men, money, and political will that a ceasefire becomes the only sustainable option, even without a formal peace agreement. The third path is political change, a shift in leadership or domestic politics in one or both countries that creates new openings for negotiation that were previously impossible.
So, David, right now, none of those three paths appears to be clearly open. Ukraine has not been able to defeat Russia militarily. Russia has not been able to conquer Ukraine as it originally intended, and neither side appears close to the kind of exhaustion that would force compromise.
That is the brutal reality of where this conflict stands. And here is what makes the situation even more complex and more dangerous. The war in Ukraine is not simply a bilateral conflict between two neighboring nations. It has become a proxy struggle, a conflict in which the decisions, resources, and political will of third parties are as decisive as the actions of the combatants themselves. Western nations, particularly the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and other NATO members, have provided Ukraine with weapons, intelligence, financial support, and diplomatic backing that have been essential to Ukraine's ability to resist and fight back. Russia, meanwhile, has received material support from Iran in the form of attack drones and from North Korea in the form of artillery ammunition and ballistic missiles. China has provided crucial economic support, buying Russian oil and gas and supplying dual-use technology that sustains Russia's war economy. This internationalization of the conflict means that ending it requires not just an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, but a realignment of calculations among all the major powers that have become invested in its outcome.
And that realignment becomes even more complicated when you consider the political changes happening in the countries that have been Ukraine's most important supporters. The return of Donald Trump to the American presidency in January 2025 introduced enormous uncertainty into Western support for Ukraine. Trump had repeatedly suggested during his campaign that he could end the war quickly, implying a deal that might require Ukraine to accept territorial concessions. European leaders, alarmed by the prospect of reduced American commitment to both Ukraine and NATO, began accelerating their own defense spending and discussing the possibility of European security guarantees for Ukraine independent of American involvement. The war has exposed, more clearly than any event since the end of the Cold War, the fault lines within the Western alliance, and the degree to which European security has depended on American commitment that can no longer be taken for granted.
And for ordinary Ukrainians, caught in the middle of these vast geopolitical calculations, the human cost continues to mount every single day. Estimates of military casualties on both sides run into the hundreds of thousands. Approximately 6 million Ukrainians have been displaced to other European countries. Entire cities, Mariupol, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, have been reduced to rubble. A generation of Ukrainian children is growing up knowing nothing but war. Whatever political or diplomatic outcome eventually emerges from this conflict, the human damage is already catastrophic and will take decades to heal.
That human dimension, those real lives, must never be lost in the abstract language of geopolitics and strategy. Every statistic represents a person, a family, a future that was stolen. David, how much total aid did Western countries commit to Ukraine by the end of 2023?
The correct answer is C, $380 billion. According to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy's Ukraine Support Tracker, Western nations had committed approximately $380 billion in total military, financial, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine by the end of 2023, making it one of the largest international aid efforts in modern history. The United States was the single largest contributor, followed by the European Union collectively and individual European nations, including Germany, the United Kingdom, and the Scandinavian countries.
$380 billion. That extraordinary number tells you how seriously Western governments have taken the principle that an unprovoked war of territorial conquest cannot be allowed to succeed. Because if it does, the international order that has prevented major European war for nearly 80 years begins to unravel.
And it tells you that the stakes of how this war ends extend far beyond Ukraine itself. They reach into the security architecture of the entire world. Okay, everyone, let's recap the vocabulary we learned today here at Dr. Speak Now, 6-Minute English. Sovereignty, the right of a nation to govern itself independently, free from external interference or control by another state. Asymmetry of war aims, the situation where two sides in a conflict want fundamentally incompatible outcomes, making negotiated compromise extremely difficult or impossible. Proxy conflict, a war in which outside powers support opposing sides, effectively fighting their own rivalries and interests to the combatants on the ground. Geopolitics, the study of how geography, power, and international relationships shape political decisions and global events. Ceasefire, a temporary agreement to stop fighting, distinct from a peace agreement which permanently resolves the underlying political dispute. Once again, our 6 minutes are up. Goodbye for now here at Dr. Speak Now, 6-Minute English.
Bye, everyone. Our thoughts remain with the people of Ukraine and with all those affected by this devastating conflict.
See you next time. Bye.